Welcome to Everyday Counseling, a podcast about understanding emotional patterns as they show up in everyday life. In this episode, we're picking up directly from what happens after the moment has passed and looking at how repeated emotional carryover quietly shapes the way people see themselves over time. When emotions are carried forward from one situation into the next, they don't just influence mood, they begin to influence interpretation. The day isn't experienced as a series of separate events anymore. It starts to feel like a continuous emotional thread. This is where self perception begins to form. You might notice this when you have a few emotionally heavy interactions close together. A difficult moment at work, tension at home, a conversation that leaves you unsettled. Individually, each moment might be manageable. Together, they start to color how you experience yourself. Instead of thinking, that was a hard moment, the thought shifts toward, I'm not coping well today, or I'm always on the edge, or I'm so bad at dealing with these things. Those conclusions don't usually come from one event, they come from accumulation. Emotional carryover creates continuity, and the mind naturally tries to make sense of that continuity. It looks for explanation. Often, the explanation lands on identity. You might recognize this in subtle ways, feeling like you're too sensitive because certain days feel emotionally heavier. Thinking of yourself as, I'm so bad with pressure because stress seems to linger longer than you expect. Seeing yourself as difficult or withdrawn because reactions show up in a familiar context. What's important here is that these self descriptions often feel true, but they're usually context based rather than fixed traits. When emotional residue builds without being recognized, the system stays slightly activated. The activation comes the background state. From there, it's easy to believe that this is simply how you are. Early episodes explored how reactions spill into relationships and how emotions carry forward. When the carryover repeats, the mind draws conclusions to explain it. Those conclusions can be surprisingly stable. You might notice that on lighter days, you don't hold the same beliefs about yourself. You feel more capable, more patient, more balanced. But on heavier days, the self story tightens. This tells us something important. Self perception isn't constant, it shifts with emotional load. The difficulty is that people often trust the self story that forms under pressure more than the one that appears when things feel easier. The heavier version feels more serious, more realistic, but that version is often shaped by what's being carried rather than who you are. You might see this clearly in how people talk about themselves after a long or demanding period. They describe themselves as worn down, ineffective, or disconnected. Once the load reduces, these descriptions often soften or disappear. This doesn't mean the early experience was imagined, it means the interpretation was influenced by accumulation. Another place this shows up is in expectations. When emotional carryover is high, people often lower expectations of themselves without realizing it. They avoid situations, delay decisions, pull back socially, not because they can't manage, but because they believe they can't. Those beliefs are rarely questioned at the time. They feel like facts. Understanding the role of the carryover changes this. It introduces an alternative explanation. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? The question becomes, what has been carried into this moment that hasn't settled yet? That question creates space between experience and identity. Over time, people who recognize this pattern become more cautious about the conclusions they draw about themselves on difficult days. They don't dismiss their feelings, but they don't let feelings define them either. This doesn't require reframing or positive thinking, it's about timing, noticing when self judgment appears in relation to emotional load. And awareness grows, self perception becomes more flexible, identity feels less rigid. People stop taking temporary states as permanent truths. This flexibility matters because it affects how people approach the next situation. When self perception softens, engagement increases. When it hardens, avoidance follows. Understanding how emotional carryover shapes self-perception is a turning point. It explains why people can feel so different about themselves depending on context, without assuming something fundamental has changed. Over the next episode, we'll explore how these self-perceptions influence behavior over time, and why people sometimes organize their lives around beliefs that formed quietly under emotional pressure.